about her. She's a nationally recognized leading expert on issues impacting the most vulnerable populations. She began her professional career as a Child Protective Services caseworker, and she's established an impressive 36-year history of advocacy and commitment to improving outcomes for children, youth, and families. Ms. James has also served as an Assistant Commissioner of Texas CPS, Child Protective Services, and as the Associate Deputy Executive Commissioner of the Center for Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparities and the Texas State Office of Minority Health. She's credentialed. She really knows her stuff, and I'll try to shorten this. But Ms. James is credited with being a catalyst for significant and nationally recognized improvements in the Texas CPS system, including a reduction in disproportionality for African American and Native American children. Under her leadership, this is the last thing I'll say, Texas became the first state in the country to pass legislation requiring CPS to address disproportionality, and she's got a Texas model she'll talk about that she's taking across the nation. Please note, she's also with the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond, that you may have index cards on the pews. If you don't, just be prepared. If you have questions you want to write down, if you did get index cards, we'll take those at the end of this, or we'll just stand up and have conversations with some of your questions. Please welcome Joyce James.
Wow, it's really great to be back in Indianapolis with all the forward-thinking people who have this commitment to undoing racism. I asked Cindy on the way over here, you know, how do you kind of keep getting away with this bold and courageous stuff? That's what they used to ask me in Texas is, Joyce, how do you last this long in a system, in a state government system in Texas using that kind of language? And so I hope to share with you all just a little bit of my journey. I'm not going to need the PowerPoint just yet. I'll let you know when. Thank you. But I want to thank you for giving me the honor of being your speaker this evening. And of course, a special thanks to Cindy for her unwavering commitment to equity and justice for all people. But more so, as I just mentioned, because of her bold and courageous commitment to undoing racism. I'm flattered by the introduction because I know that I stand before you because of the life works of many who face mighty struggles fighting against racism so that I would have the opportunity to stand here. And as I have grown older and begun to become a little bit more wise in terms of understanding how we get to the places that we get to, I've decided that we cannot ignore what God has done for us. And though I know people may be in different places on that, I want you to know that I grew up in a poor family in a little town called Port Arthur, Texas. None of you have probably ever heard of it. In a segregated part of town, attended all black schools through high school, and rode with my mother in the backseat of cars of white women that she worked for who said they loved us. And my understanding of racism causes me to believe that they really did have a heart for us, but many times we are unconscious of the way in which we play out racism in our interactions with other people. And so I have a long history of working in social work profession. As Angela mentioned, I was blessed to be the first African American, the first in 2004, to head the child welfare system in the state of Texas. You know, in how many years since we've been doing child welfare work in that state, and to be the first in 2004. But I take it as an opportunity that came at just the right time. And so I have worked to address these issues. I've worked to eliminate disproportionality for African American and Native American children, and to make sure that in doing that work, that we were improving outcomes for all children, youth, and families. And what I know is that when we work to address racism, though we may focus on particular groups, that our work will yield positive results for all people. Because when we raise the bar for those who are least likely to have the outcomes that we desire, we raise the bar for all. And we saw that through our work in Texas. So after about 36 years in state government, I came to a mutual agreement with my new boss that we could not agree on the fact that institutionalized racism does exist, and we agreed to disagree, which meant that it was time for me to go. And I have been, at some point in our lives, we have to stand for something. And so I made a commitment some time ago that people would come to know me to take a stand against racism. And they would only invite me in knowing that. And if that was not the conversation that they wanted to have, then they would not invite Joyce James to come. And so I had worked for far too many years to get to where I was in my understanding of this issue to suddenly be asked to just pretend that it no longer existed. And so I'm blessed now to have my own consulting business where I continue to do this work in various states across the country. So I stand before you this evening as a person who, except by the grace of God, could be struggling with many of the issues that the oppressed in this country, in this state, and right here in this city face on a daily basis. And I have come to realize that I have done nothing on my own. A lot of times we look down on people who are oppressed and we say things like if they would do what we did. But we really have to understand that none of us are where we are today solely because of what we did on our own. And so for me, I thank God for where I am. And, the fact that He has directed my path every step of the way, and every place that I have been has been for what I believe is the fulfillment of His purpose for me. So I don't believe that I have been in any place by accident. And my work is often guided and driven by the Holy Spirit. I don't usually give talks in this context, but I've decided that if I truly believe that as a Christian, and I consider myself to be a Christian, that if I truly believe that, and I believe that I am where I am because of that higher power, then I have to share that. And so that's why I share it with you all this evening. And so I'll be your keynote speaker this evening. I believe that I have a message to bring to you all. And I hope that it will inspire you and enlighten you and help us to leave this place this evening with a better understanding of how racism continues to divide all of us, and it will start to close the gap between us. So I may use some language that may feel uncomfortable. So even though my message is guided by the Holy Spirit, I may use some language that may make you feel uncomfortable, for some, are contrary to the beliefs that some of us have. But nonetheless, I've made the commitment that whenever I have the privilege and honor of being in a space to share my own personal experiences around this issue with others, that my commitment is to do that. And so the work that we have to do to undo racism is not easy, and it requires a level of risk-taking. But I decided some years ago that the benefits far outweigh the risk. And not doing work to undo racism is a burden, and it bears down heavily upon many people. So let me begin by sharing just a little bit about my journey and how I came to understand the oppressive nature of institutional and structural racism in all of our systems, including in religious systems. So I also do this work in various church congregations, different denominations, because the church will commit to working to eliminate and undo racism, but we have to understand the history and the role of the church in perpetuating and sustaining racism. So I've been a social worker for 36 years, and again, I started my career as a frontline child protective services caseworker, and I've served in all of those positions that Angela mentioned. But I knew from my very first position that there was something that was just not right in the way that the cases that I had were being handled. The services provided and the decisions that were being made appeared to me very early to have some kind of racial tone to it. But that was a long time ago, remember? So like most people, I hesitated to raise any issue that implied racism as a factor. And so, like most, I stayed silent for far too long. And you know, one morning about 20 years ago, shows you it took me almost 16 years to take the kind of risk that we must all at some point decide we're willing to take if we truly want to undo racism. And so I used a method which was to ask for some data about the children in foster care in my area. And what I found was really alarming. It just confirmed what I already knew, but Black children represented 29% of the child population in my largest county, and they represented almost 80% of the children in foster care. And so that reality kind of hit me. And you know, it just struck me to the core because I had been silent for far too long, and I had not come to my work to hurt, as most people don't come to their profession to hurt, they come to help. But when we don't understand racism, the data tells us that we continue to perpetuate the same disparate outcomes. And so for me, data led to even more questions, but it also gave me confidence. The more questions I asked, the more confident I became in asking questions. And so some of my questions were, why are African American children more likely to be removed, less likely to be reunited with their families, have more placements while in foster care, receive fewer services while in care, have lower high school graduation rates, are more likely to age out of the system less prepared for adulthood than their white peers? Now, I asked those questions about 20 years ago. We can ask those same questions today. And part of the reason why we can ask those same questions is because we have not gone to the core, the underlying cause of these issues, which is institutional and structural racism. And so it's been a long journey from my days as a frontline caseworker and supervisor in the field. And I can tell you that I have loved this work from the very beginning, and still today it pains me to see what has happened in child welfare systems across the country continue to repeat itself. And so the thing that has stood out most for me and that I carry with me in the work that I do today is the faces of the children who made up my very first caseload. Jimmy, who is now deceased, Rebecca, Tanya, Curtis, Linda, Brenda, Karen, Morris, Kim, Lynn, Michelle, Robbie, and so many more, the majority of whom were older Black teenagers who had been in foster care for far too many years. You see, when we can begin to think about children, families, the elderly, whatever profession we're in, and put in a name and a face to our work, and not referring to it as a caseload or whatever the names we use, then it becomes real for us. And so thinking back, I never would have placed my own children in many of the facilities that I placed those teenagers in. And I can still feel pain in my heart today for the many times that I dropped them off far away from their home communities with strangers in places, again, that I never would have wanted my own children to be in. But here's how institutional racism works. Those facilities were licensed by the state of Texas, and similar facilities are still licensed in various states across the country, where we disproportionately place older Black children in residential and more restrictive placements than we do white children. And so I wanted just desperately to change the circumstances that the research indicated brought those families and those children to our attention. And at first I thought about it in terms of the cause being things like poverty, substance abuse, lack of education and job skills, lack of community resources and supports, and all of those things that we think about that we attribute to the individual. But because of the Undoing Racism workshop, I added institutional racism to the list. And I came to understand then, and I understand today, that what we really need to change is our commitment to undoing racism. Because none of the other things will work in isolation of understanding how racism contributes to perpetuating and sustaining the outcomes that we continue to see over the years. So it was this workshop that helped me to see more clearly the reasons for disproportionality and disparities as we struggle through the discussions on history, culture, race, and especially on history. I'm not going to go into a discussion on history tonight because as the other two trainers that are here from the People's Institute will tell you that this workshop builds on certain foundation and pieces of information that lead up to talking about the history. And so I just encourage you to work with child advocates to attend an Undoing Racism workshop. But it was in that workshop that I learned how institutional racism was why we were losing our children from our communities. You know, it was why we were seeing so many of our young men into the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. You know, it was why some communities were suffering from health disparities at a greater rate than others. And so when we understand how institutional and structural racism manifests in our systems and institutions, then we can really tackle it at the core. And so as long as we try to address these issues at the surface level, pointing outward instead of looking inward at systemic barriers and challenges, then we keep developing programs and services to fix broken people. And we don't hold our systems and institutions accountable. So in my work and through my participation in numerous Undoing Racism workshops by the People's Institute, I came to understand the manifestations. And I made a commitment back then that I was not going to allow racism to make me prisoner, as Joe Barnes would say. I refuse to be a prisoner of racism. And many of us are today, unconsciously. But it's our business to know if we truly are about interrupting and ultimately eliminating racism. And so I believe that we have lost much of our humanity because of our inability to be consciously aware of the ways in which institutional and structural racism works. And there is a process that we talk about in the workshop that's about socialization. And part of what we see that contributes to our numbness around racism, that contributes to the unconsciousness around racism, has to do with what racism has done to all of us and how it manifests in us in different ways, in the form of something that we call internalized racial oppression, where we act out racism in different ways. And so for persons of color, I don't like that term, but I would have to name everybody. And so for people who look like me, racism impacts us in a way that we internalize racial inferiority. And for whites, it's the opposite. It's the internalization of superiority. And so it's important to understand how those things come together to create certain attitudes and assumptions that we hold to be true about certain groups and about certain communities. And that when we dig deep enough into those old attitudes and assumptions and stereotypes, then we understand how racism has created those attitudes and assumptions that are most often not based on fact. And I'm going to do a little piece just a little bit later on to help us to kind of begin to think more about that. But it is racism that has shaped the attitude and assumptions we hold about poor people and people of color, causing us to respond to their sufferings by blaming them for their circumstances. We have heard it said that if they just became more responsible, if they just valued education, if they just stopped being so lazy, if they just supervised their children, if they just stopped living off the system and liking it, if they would just get a job, there are plenty out there, right? If they stopped abusing drugs and alcohol, if they were not so criminal-minded, they could do better if they wanted to. I made it, they can too. Sounds familiar? Maybe not from you, but we've heard those things said about people who are poor and oppressed. Yes, they just don't want anything, and the list goes on and on and on. So to undo racism is to examine the powerful way in which we have all been socialized, again, to see broken people and not to see the brokenness of our systems and institutions. And there is a history that goes back hundreds of years that has deeply socialized all of us to see and accept the bookends that define our place in society. And those bookends have been in place historically, and they're still in place today. And what they show in every system and institution is that whites have the best outcomes, and blacks generally have the worst outcomes, and other populations fluctuate somewhere in the middle. We have even become numb to thinking about that in a way that we would get some level of energy or even some anger, I would say, about why these conditions have existed for so very long for the same population of people. And so it is when we understand that racism has done something disparate to all of us that then we can change our response and our attitude and assumptions to the things that go around us, go on around us every day. I was mentioning on the way over that almost every day there's a shooting, every week for sure, but we have become so accustomed to it that we barely mention it. We just go on, we can't even keep count anymore. You know, what needs to happen for us to get some energy and to relieve ourselves of this numbness and to begin to think about ways to organize with each other so that we can collectively work to undo the racism that continues to contribute to the outcomes that none of us want to see. And so I say that we have to make ourselves vulnerable. And I tell you, in making that commitment to go to an Undoing Racism workshop, that's one step towards willingness to be vulnerable, to engage in unpopular and even uncomfortable conversations that help us to understand how deeply rooted racism is and how it has changed over the years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act. But in other words, we have to become conscious. So, you know, we hear people say all the time that it's been more than 50 years since Dr. King led the March on Washington and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act that set in motion new laws and policies against racism in this country. And yes, the Civil Rights Act attacked many of the racial policies and practices that were at the root of the suffering and that profoundly contributed to negative outcomes for many in this country. But I have to ask the question, how much has changed? You know, we really want to believe, because we're well-meaning and well-intentioned and good-hearted people, you know, we want to believe that things have gotten so much better. And certainly I don't want to negate that many things have changed and some things have gotten better. But where is the evidence of the equity that should be achieved through the civil rights movement and where is the evidence of that? What are the specific issues that still hold the racial divide in place? And how do we know that we have not yet achieved equity? And what will be the signs to let us know if and when we do achieve it? So what does racial equity look like? And can we see it? And can we envision it? And I say that something profound has to happen to shake us out of our numbness, to cause us to examine the truth around things that we have held to for far too many years. Things that we don't routinely examine because we just know it's so. But when we put ourselves in a position to be willing to question some of the things that we think we know, as my friend Mahdi would say, then we take that to another level in terms of our willingness to be vulnerable and to struggle and to question and to examine. So issues of poverty, power, and privilege impact the very fabric of our society and the health, economic, and emotional well-being of individuals, families, and communities. So the civil rights movement did result in gains toward achieving racial equity. However, the data still shows that whites have considerably better outcomes in the United States, in Indiana, in Indianapolis, even when we control for other factors. So could it possibly be about our beliefs about race and inferior and superior beings, thinking that it is deeply rooted in history of all of our institutions, so that despite our celebration of 50 years since the passage of the civil rights legislation and the launching of the war on poverty, these concerns continue to demand the attention of and action by systems, institutions, and communities. So what is equity? And I say we will not have equity until we undo racism. Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted their outcomes in life. And we know what racial equity looks like, but what we rarely discuss or examine at a deeper level is the root cause of racial inequities. And so I want to go quickly to a couple of slides that I'd like to share with you that really speaks to an analysis that I have around racism and racial inequities. And I don't want to look behind me, but so these observations actually grew out of a model that I developed and used to address disproportionality and disparities in Texas, child welfare. And when we did an evaluation of the model, we found these key observations. And so the first one is that racial inequities look the same across systems. So it doesn't matter if you are looking at data for child welfare, for education, for juvenile justice, for criminal justice, for housing, for health, for economics. It doesn't matter where you're looking. It looks the same for the same population of people in every system. And so for me, that says that we either have to believe that there is something inherently wrong or inferior about the people who experience these outcomes, or we have to be willing to turn the mirror inward, to become critical lovers, agitators, advocates against racism in our systems and institutions, and to delve deep enough into the data and examine the why, and as Diana Dunn would say, ask why more than one time, but to actually go deep to the core of these issues to understand why. And then secondly, that systems contribute significantly to the racial disparities and inequities that we see. And I've already talked about the fact that when we work in systems, or even when we advocate for good outcomes for people that we are, want to see have better outcomes, even if we're not working in the system, our approach has generally been to design new programs and new services that we well-meaningly think is for the betterment of the people that we're designing those programs for. But when we do that in the absence of understanding institutional and structural racism and how it has placed people in the condition that they're in, then we don't go to the core of the issue. And one example that I like to share is that I had the opportunity to do a weekend retreat at a church group on understanding the role of the church in understanding and undoing racism. And it just happened to be held on the Saturday when they were feeding the homeless. And so to make a point, I said, we really do need to have programs to feed the homeless, to, food pantries, to clothes pantries, to clothe. We need to do all those things. But we're not working to undo racism until we understand what are the systemic barriers and factors that have contributed to people having to stand in this line on Saturday morning. Are they poor, as I mentioned earlier, because it's all about what's broken about them or what they don't value, but are there some real systemic reasons that have caused people to be situated the way they are? And that's a very powerful exercise that's done in the Undoing Racism workshop that I would encourage you again to have that experience. It creates a whole new awareness and understanding. So the fact that are we advocating for changes in laws and policies that might give jobs to people who have been oftentimes given criminal records for things that other people don't get the same sentences for? Are we advocating for rehabilitation for people who may have committed a crime so that they can get out of prison or jail or wherever and work? No, we would rather have soup lines, and clothes closets and all those things that make us feel good. I would venture to say that the people who are standing in the line don't feel good about standing in the line. We feel good about the fact that they have come to our place. And I'm not saying we don't need those programs, because we really do need them. But at the same time, we need to go upstream and figure out what has caused them to be in the line. And when we tackle it at that level and undo racism, then we can use our funds to do some other things to help support communities to grow and thrive. The third observation is that the systems level disparities cannot be explained by a few bad apples or ill-intentioned officers. I have had the opportunity to do workshops with high-level cross-systems leaders, including law enforcement. And at a time when shootings and violence are certainly in the minds of people all across the country, I made a specific point to say that it's not enough to just remove the bad individual. Yes, we have to be held accountable as individuals, but if that was what it took, then once we got rid of the bad people, then the problem should go away, right? For me, that says that what we see is that racism is embedded in the very fabric of our systems and institutions. And until we understand that and begin to change the culture and the racist policies and practices, and we understand that not from looking at individual acts of meanness, hatred, and bigotry, but rather looking at it through a lens that says there is something that has been in place historically and that is still operating today that causes these things to continue to happen even when we think we rid ourselves of the bad apple. And so for me, undoing racism is not about having conversations about who is racist. It's not about having conversations about individual actors, although certainly there is an impact on people as individuals, but it's really about understanding the systemic nature of racism and how it permeates all of our systems and institutions. So when we think about shootings, both white officers and black officers are more likely to shoot black men. And you know, if you don't understand racism and what it does to all of us, then we don't have a clear understanding about, you know, how the messages that I have internalized about people who look like me, because I have been told by every system and institution that I'm inferior, and so if you look like me, you are inferior and worthless as well, but also the way in which we conform to the systems and institutions. You know, so there's something that happens to people once they actually get inside of systems and institutions that really causes us oftentimes to go against our own personal values and beliefs. And if we don't see that at work, then we let it happen. And so the key to not allowing that to happen is to understand how racism works to cause us to contribute to sustaining it in systems and institutions. And then poor outcomes are concentrated in poor communities and communities of color. And I'm not sure about here in Indianapolis, but I believe it is true that if I pull data for education, child welfare, juvenile justice, health, employment, that there are certain areas in the community that you could point to and say that the outcomes are disparate for the people who live in those communities. Is that true? But the question is, why do we think that's true? And what about racism causes that to be true? So if we just point in and say, oh, you know, the people who live there, everything that's wrong is what's wrong about them, then what we put in place will never change their conditions. May help a few people, but we will continue to see more and more people continue to be in that situation and that condition. And so our helping systems don't feel like help to people whose outcomes are disparate in their relationship with every system and institution that says they come into those communities to help. Yet when you look at the data, not much has changed. So it's important to really get to know the way in which systems exclude, exploit, oppress, and underserve people in poor communities and in communities of color. See, it's very easy for us to have conversations about all the good things that we do. You know, we go into the community and we do all these good things, and but when it comes time to talk about becoming what I call critical lovers of our systems and institutions, we have a hard time coming up with those answers about what are the things that we do that contribute to the conditions that people are in and to the way they're situated in communities. And so that's some thinking that is required. And then lastly, because I always like to give us some hope, Systemic training and intervention does work to change thinking and reduce disproportionality and disparities. And there's research and evidence of it right here in Indianapolis with the work that Child Advocates has done. Because I and a researcher on my team actually led the research. And we looked at the impact of the Undoing Racism workshop, and we looked at the impact of a shorter workshop that I do, and we found that it makes a difference. And it actually makes a difference for all, while at the same time lifting those who are least likely to have the desired outcomes. And so when we know better, we do better. We hear that all the time. I say it's our business to know better. And that a lot of the times why we don't get to that place where we talk about racism is because it's so difficult to have a conversation about something that has not been normal for us. It's not a common everyday discussion, except, I talk about it with my family all the time. But until we can do that in a cross-racial setting, where we come to understand and have, a common language and definition of racism, where then we can kind of break down the defenses around talking about racism and recognizing that the willingness to do that will get us to that place where we'll realize our vision for why we work and advocate and do whatever we do to try to change outcomes for people that we say we care about. And so I want to just briefly move on to, would you go to the next one, please? This was a circle, but it didn't transfer over to their system in a circle. It's much more powerful to me when it's in a circle, but what I wanted to show is what I call the design of systems. And the first thing about systems is that they are decades old. And so I don't imagine that anybody in this room was sitting at the table when our systems were designed by our forefathers a long time ago, right? Anybody had anything to do with the design of those systems? Nobody wants to take credit for that? So we didn't have anything to do with the design of the systems, and a lot of times we'll use that as an excuse to say, well, we didn't have anything to do with the way those systems were set up. That was a long time ago. I say we didn't build a house, but we live in it. And so we have inherited it, whether we were at the table at the time, whether we had any part in it, we own it today. And so how accountable are we willing to be around issues that continue to destroy our humanity? And so the other thing that we know about systems and institutions is that they are very resistant to change. So when we say institutionalize something, what do we mean? What does that mean, to institutionalize it? Pardon me? Ingrained culture. We want it to last. And that's the way our systems and institutions were initially set up. We wanted them to stay the way they were designed. A lot of people spend a lot of time and effort and energy thinking about the what ifs and trying to put something in place that would not allow them to change. Think about now the way we develop policy. We say, oh, well, what about this? And so we'll tweak it and tweak it and tweak it until we think we've got it just the way we want it to be, right? Well, that's what we did with the design of our systems and institutions. And so they're very, very resistant to change. And as a matter of fact, they're so hard to change, there's so much bureaucracy and red tape sometimes that we won't even take the step to make change even when we know it's not working or it's wrong, because it's just going to take too much to make the change. And so that's the nature and design of systems. So what we really have to work towards for our systems is transformation. We can't tweak it a little bit here or there, because it was set up in a certain way to operate a certain way, and it has not worked for all of us. And so there's also the oppressive relationship that systems and institutions have with communities that are people that they were supposedly set up to help. And so it doesn't feel like help when every indicator of my well-being is determined by, the color of my skin or where I live. It does not feel like help. And so I don't want to negate the fact that many systems and institutions have been a window of opportunity to many of us, but it does not feel like help to large populations of people all across this country. And the other thing that keeps us from working to undo racism or even having a conversation about racism is that systems also oppress the people that work inside of them, to the extent that we fear having a conversation about racism. Remember, I was there as a caseworker. I've made decisions for children and families that I never would have made for my own children and families, but I was silent. I didn't have a space to talk about race or racism. I didn't even have an understanding or a definition of it to be able to even raise the issue. And so again, I keep putting in a plug for the Undoing Racism workshop because it gave me the courage. It answered the questions that I was struggling with. It gave me the information that I needed to have when I did raise the issue. When someone questioned, then I could come back with some factual information to keep the conversation going. And so oppression runs deep in our systems and institutions, including in the church. Since we're in the church, I just thought I'd throw that out. So, yeah, it still is one of our most segregated institutions. And then lastly, white people have the best outcomes in all of our systems and institutions. Why is that? Did you all hear that? We designed them. Huh? So if every system and institution was designed by whites, for whites, to the exclusion of all other peoples, until when? Now, forever? See it? Yeah. But when supposedly? So the 1960s. Okay. And then we want to think that that was so long ago that we don't need to be having conversations about it today, right? Come on now, the laws change, we let everybody in, right? So if you're not doing well, that's on you, right?
Those decades-old systems haven't changed that much, as hard as we work at it.
So I would venture to say that well-meaning people made a decision that at that point in time, some populations were not doing well because they didn't have access to systems and institutions that were benefiting whites, and that they would open the door and let folks in, right? But nothing about the system changed. Come in, right? Now we're all equal. Discounting hundreds of years of oppression, right? Discounting different culture, different experiences. And so now that people have access to systems and institutions, we used to consider that it was racism and it was legal. But once the laws changed and everybody had a chance to supposedly come in, then it's not racism anymore, right? But the bookends are still in place because the laws changed, but we still have never achieved the level of equity, and we will not until we transform our systems and institutions to understand that racism still lives and breathes in those systems and institutions. And so I say that we're not working for equality, but instead we're working for equity. You know, and racism lives and breathes in institutions to the extent that, you know, we've come up with names for our inequities. Maybe we can just see a couple. Not going to go through all these, but the point is, we have accepted inequities, racism to the extent that our systems and institutions have names. Disproportionality in child welfare, right? Health disparities in the healthcare system. And health disparities are defined as preventable differences in the burden of disease and disability to achieve optimal health. Anything strike you about that definition? So if health disparities are preventable, why do we have them? And I asked in Texas, why is it that African Americans and Hispanics die from 7 of the 10 leading causes of disease in Texas? Diseases that are unnecessary, preventable, avoidable, cannot be attributed to individual pathology. So what that says to me is that we're not going to the core of these issues. Because as long as we place the burden and responsibility and say, oh, it's all about eating right and exercising and getting your doctor's appointments, and we don't think about things like place matters, food deserts, toxic waste and pollution in poor communities, then if we don't address it at the systemic level and understand that that is a form of racism, then we continue to place the burden. And then there's disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system, where African American and Hispanic youth are more likely to be adjudicated, sent to state lockup, and certified to stand trial as an adult for the same crimes that white youth commit. Can we fathom the racism in that? Now, undoing racism is not about advocating for more punitive responses to white people, but it is about understanding the differential response of systems that are predictable by race. And that is the way that we can define the racism in the system's response. In that race will predict who's more likely to be locked up, who's more likely to be disciplined in school, starting in pre-K. It will predict whose children are most likely to be removed. It will predict who's more likely to be stopped, searched, sent to state jail, and end up with a drug felony. And we don't even have time this evening to talk about the system's change in response to the drug problems today. And to be consciously aware that when the drug issue shifted over to impact a larger population of whites, that the system's response to that changed. And so now we have ads on TV talking about it as a disease. We're not talking about being tough on crime and criminalizing it more. We're talking about treating it. And so there's something that happens in the socialization process that creates the thinking that then causes people to act out in different ways and respond in different ways that are often predictable by race. And so the achievement gap in education, the same thing, and for the same people. You know, so are black and brown kids just dumb? then why is it that in every education system across the country, they're not achieving?
Because the teachers aren't being trained. It goes back to training.
So part of it is that it's not about the individual teacher. It's about how systems and institutions are preparing their workforce to understand racism, to understand how to work in poor communities and communities of color, to understand why they're poor. A recent study showed that kindergarten through third grade teachers have lower expectations of African American kindergartners. So it's no wonder what we see happen at third grade, right? They lose interest in school. And so that's how racism operates. And yes, it operates at the individual level, it operates at the institutional level, it operates at the structural level. But where we want to attack it at is at the systemic institutional level, because a lot of people are doing good things and it's helping some individuals, but it's not enough to help a few. We have to transform our systems and institutions so that we interrupt and ultimately eliminate racism. And so we're not working so that everybody can be treated equally. We want equity. And I have a little slide that just kind of shows us the difference between equality and equity. Because treating everybody equal, as supposedly the civil rights laws were intended to do, did not result in equity. And it doesn't cost any more to have equity, if you notice. But often we are not even willing to have the courage to say we need to put more over here, because we are a treat everybody the same, colorblind society, right? I challenge anybody who thinks they're colorblind to take an implicit bias test. So does this strike you in any way? I had a commissioner in another state recently say, I need that. In Austin, Texas, where I live, the city council had a pot of money that they wanted to use to give to each of the 9 districts. And the money was to be used to improve sidewalks and lighting and bike lanes. And they wanted to give each council person the same amount of money for their district. Well, some districts don't even have sidewalks. And some have exclusive bike lanes already. And so that just really doesn't make sense. But a lot of times it's to go along with that so that people won't complain. And usually the people who are complaining are the ones who already have the most. But if you will look at this, you see that, as a woman told me in Connecticut, she stood up and said, well, I see that I could give up some of my white privilege and it really wouldn't hurt me. Because taking the box away didn't diminish the fact that when you move to the other side, now everyone can see, right? In Iowa, they found a third slide, which I haven't added yet. It was where the fence just came down. So think about getting there, getting to where we just take the fence down. And so part of why we struggle with wanting to be equal is because oftentimes we think that some people are just not deserving. And we get all these messages that we internalize that shape our lens that's predictable by race. And so I want to show you one more picture before how much time do we have? I'm good? Here's a picture I want to show. I want to show you this picture. Because it's probably true in Indiana as it is in Texas, where this data comes from. So African Americans are 2 to 8 times as likely to have poor outcomes as whites across systems: education, health, child welfare, juvenile justice, criminal justice. What if that were reversed and it read whites are 2 to 8 times as likely to have poor outcomes in systems compared to African Americans? Would we be numb? What would happen? We would change the system, right? Then what is it that causes us to not have that same level of what? Concern. You know, Maria says, they ask her, why are you so angry? And she said, why you not? I'm saying, and really, day after day after day, we see and hear and read about these things, and it's as if it just doesn't faze us. So what is it about the way in which we have been socialized to see some groups as inferior and others as superior that causes us to not have the same level of concern? When I'm working with educators and I show all these horrible data and outcomes about graduation rates, special ed, discipline, who's not in gifted and talented programs, and I say, now suppose this were white kids. When I'm showing that data, people are just quiet. They're not saying, it's like, we expect that. And then when I say, what if it were reversed? They say heads would roll. Some people would lose their jobs. It wouldn't be about what's wrong with these kids because the system would change. Y'all are shaking your head saying, yes, we know that, right? We know that. And so we have to become conscious of ways in which we get messages that causes us to think that. And so I have just one last example of how we get those messages. So I was in Iowa, just happened to be there the day this ran in the Iowa Gazette. So these are 6 young men who all committed the same crime. And look at the pictures of them. The black men have mug shots. That's how we get socialized around who's bad and who's more criminal. And we hold that to be true until we understand racism. Powerful, huh? And so to become conscious of other ways in which racism skews our lens and our understanding and causes us to go to false assumptions about the why of the outcomes that we're seeing for the same population of people in every one of our systems and institutions. I have a lot more, but there's not time tonight.